Hi everyone, my name is Charlie, and today I have decided to dedicate entirely to writing. The last time I think this happened was when I finished writing Royally Doris, and I just knew I was approaching the end of that book, so knuckled down and wrote for the entire day. I didn't have to do this with Mistakes Mean Murder. There were occasional rushes of writing for a long time, but there was never one of these where I dedicated the entire day to it. I do have some things that I would like to get done as well. I want to start rereading Streets of Laredo by Larry McMurtry, and I'll definitely have to take Sally out for a walk because it's a really nice spring day, and who wants to miss out on that? Some of the things that I need to write are poems for Poems and Pints. It got pushed back from last week to this Wednesday, and hopefully the venue will have their license by this Wednesday and we will be able to share our poems. One thing that's been preventing me from writing poetry recently is that all of the poems I have been writing for this second collection have all been about characters, and I want to write some more poetry that is perhaps from the I voice, or that is observations of spring, because that is what the second collection's about, really. It's about spring, and there is a little modicum of love in there and looking at love because of this whole aspect of spring fever. I also want to get some landscape poems in there. I think I've written 2 so far, but I definitely want some more in there. There have been times where I've written lines and noted stuff down for landscape poems, and then those images have ended up in other poems, so they've been used, but perhaps not the way in which I first intended for them to be used. So I have a few poems started in my notebook. The only thing is, I know that all of the poems I have started in my notebook are more character observations or stories from my family. Indeed, there's the story of the time that my father got arrested whilst in a phone box, and they were arresting him for robbing a post office, but he couldn't have done it, and then he had this alibi of 5 different women he'd been to that night, so it couldn't have been him. And I wrote that into a poem, and I wrote another story from my family history as a poem, because, you know, I still want this linking between the collections, and I think that that's something that I do regularly in my poetry. So I have that. And then I finally wrote a poem about when my father got eaten by a crocodile. Most people know that story. If you don't, just tell me and I'll tell it one day, because it's not that big a deal. My father wasn't actually eaten by a crocodile, but Charlie, as a 4-year-old, had a very anxious mind indeed. The main thing that I'm wanting to write is the beginning of a new story. I won't be revealing any details about this, but I hinted towards it in this week's vlog, which was last Wednesday. I took Sally for a long walk around Macclesfield Forest, and I saw something growing out of a tree, and that immediately got this idea going through my head, and I still had about an hour's walk left. And as I walked, this idea built and built, and these questions started getting asked, and this story formed. And when I got home, I just wrote 3 pages of notes straight away. Like, I didn't speak to my mother, who was sat there. I just went straight upstairs, got my notebook, came back downstairs, and this is a notebook in which I've tried to keep my writing incredibly neat. Not that you can see it there, but oh, I shouldn't show you that page because that is spoilers for the second book. But yeah, I tried to keep my writing relatively neat in this notebook, and then I got to making these notes last week, and I was just scrolling all over the page because I had to note down what I had concocted on the walk. Then I wrote about 200 words of it the following morning, and whenever I had a spare moment in the last few days, I've been writing in it. So I want to get a good chunk of the beginning of that story written. I don't know whether that's what I'm going to present at the writers group this Thursday. We do have a read around planned, But part of me thinks, is it too early to be sharing this story with people? If I share this story, is it going to lose some of the magic and some of the attraction? If people start questioning things and I have to come up with answers? Or do I just say to everyone beforehand, I'm just having a bit of fun, I don't know whether this idea is going to go anywhere, but I just wish to share it? I'm not sure yet, but I thought that today I would bring you along for my day of writing. We're starting the day off with the new story at 717 words. Ideally, I'd like to see that get up to 2,000. If I could surpass that, I would be happy. I think that I'm going to go back to writing how I've known works for me in the past, which is to write this entire thing with no chapters at all if I do choose to continue with it, because I just find that the form of chapters makes it a bit difficult for me. And if I don't write with chapters, then I don't mind just going through the motions, and then I can find places to put those natural breaks in. Either way, that's the plan for today. I'm going to go and make myself a fresh cup of tea, and then I'm going to get started. I couldn't contend with being backlit, so I've come over to this settee by the rear window, looking out over the back garden, so that I can talk about my first hour of writing. I typed up the two poems I mentioned. One is based on the story of a family member, and the other was the story I mentioned about myself and the time that my father got eaten by a crocodile. That took most of the hour, and then I've just typed up another poem that I'd forgotten about and keep forgetting about in my notebook, which is one that I wrote during a writers group, and it's again based on a true story. But another issue I've got with this one is the fact that it feels like another character one, in which I'm talking about something that happened to a former colleague of mine when we were both volunteers. It's got to be about 14 years ago, and it was the first time I'd ever heard the phrase arse over tit. This volunteer had had a fall when she was going down these cobbles. So this experience left my colleague feeling very disenchanted, because she recognised that had this happened 30 years earlier, then people would have just laughed at her and they'd have made a joke of things. But because of her age, or at least she assumed because of her age, everyone came rushing towards her and helped her and rang ambulances and things, which she didn't necessarily need, but people were just concerned about it. And she says that that was one of the moments she recognised that she was of a certain age. I'm saying this an hour after I started recording this because my brother and my dad came home. They're still keeping these weird hours because of lambing. So we had a brew, we've had a chat. I did get some writing done of this story that I mentioned earlier. I've done some further research into folk tales and folklore from the Peak District, because I think that this is a book that's going to be steeped in that, or steeped in a mythology in any case. For certain parts of it, there are definitely going to be some inspirations taken. I'm definitely being inspired by certain stories that I already know. This research is just a way for me to remind myself of stories that I've heard, but also try and not throw all of it into this story, because that has been something that's happened before. I'm also twisting some folklore a bit and giving this story its own take on certain aspects of mythology, simply to help propel the story along. So whilst I know that certain things aren't necessarily true to the folklore that I've read before and that I know, this is what I think needs to happen for the story that I'm telling. It's also strange for me to be so invigorated to write something when I I hadn't expected this idea to come along a week ago, and it arrived so suddenly on Wednesday and has since gone on to overwhelm my mind to the point that I feel like I've constantly got to be writing. But there's also this aspect where the research comes in and I can spend 20 minutes reading up on something. And so I'm finding all of these stories about my local area, as I say, and I keep getting recommended Alan Garner's books, The Weird Stone of Brisingamen and The Moon of Gomrath, which I think that every child in Cheshire reads because he set them in Macclesfield and so many places that are familiar to us get mentioned. And so there are places that I keep thinking of mentioning in my own work and then finding out that Alan Garner already used them. So I might go back and read those books at some point. I did own them, then I got rid of them, and so I don't know when I'll do that because I'm also not buying any new books this year. But also part of me thinks just to write the darn thing. I sent Charlie a question earlier today, and I'm hoping she doesn't know that this means that I'm working on something else. Because, like I say, I don't actually know whether this is something that I will continue with or whether it's just something to while away my time before I feel comfortable enough to go back to Alice Valentine's world. At the same time, I find myself saying, just write it. Just write it, get down the words on the page, and then worry about whether something fits later on. It's always a fun time, I think, beginning a new project, but I also have to remind myself not to get ahead of myself, which has been something that I've had to do since I was very young. When I was from about the age of 11 until the age of 20, I would start many projects and then never go much further than the 30,000 word mark. I have talked about that on this channel before, where I would reach 30,000 words and give up on a project because I was wishing that it had been done for the time that I'd been spending on it. But when I was 11 years old, I did write my first novel, and then I believe at that time I was writing a novel every 6 months because I would start one, write for 6 months, finish it, start another one, and I don't actually own the original one that I wrote all those years ago. It was just a case of me just writing stuff down that didn't really work at all. I'd discover something and I decided that I was going to throw that in there. So these were all very much experiments when I was younger. And then some things will happen in my writing nowadays and I'll get reminded of those books that I wrote when I was a teenager. And I'll think, oh, well, this clearly harkens back to that. But I also, when I talk about not getting ahead of myself, to go back to that point, I am talking about how I would so often get excited about a project and I would put in so much research and so much work, and I would tell my friends what I was writing and how this story was going to go, and they'd get excited for me, and then inevitably or invariably I would give up on those books. And I've always felt bad for the way that my friends would get so invested in helping me with these projects only for me to throw them away, and I feel like I was wasting their time as well as my own. At the same time, I think that it's a part of experimenting as a writer. There are stories that I came up with over a decade ago that I think about returning to, and think about how friends had told me to stick with these projects because they were perhaps my most original. I do find that aspects from those books do influence some of the stories I write now. Like the first Alice Valentine book was based on a crime novel that I started writing when I was 12, and I can't regularly push that story aside, and then all of these different elements came together to tell that story. I guess I'm just thinking about that a lot at the moment. This story here, it feels strange because it arrived in my head so fully formed and I can see the entire scope of this book. Yet there's always that part of me in my head who's going way far into the future rather than just being here in the present and thinking, just write the thing. But for now, I am going to get changed and take the dog out for a walk because I've written another 500 words for this story, and I think that's a good time to take a break, be back within the hour, and then just keep going for the afternoon if we are going to do this full day of writing that I'd hoped for. As always, when I sit in this corner, this is a reminder to please not question the mess on this bureau behind me. It's probably been the same mess that's been there for 6 years. When my father piled his papers and a toy of flosses got placed once when Sally tore it apart. Back from my walk, I did not know that the football club around the corner from me, Macclesfield Football Club, most people know about it. I had no idea that they were having this big event because it's the May bank holiday. And so the streets surrounding me are more packed than they get when there's a match on. Usually the one-way system around the corner from me and the main road are packed full of cars as well as the car park. However, they have come all the way down the road that I usually park on. So I am currently parked in front of somebody else's space in front of my house. Now, usually there aren't actually any appointed spaces on this street apart from people's drives, but I think that everyone's just got accustomed to people parking in specific places, so I feel pretty awkward about where I've parked. But I can't do anything about it because there was no other option, because whatever is happening at the football club has caused people to just park wherever they like, and I just got stuck in traffic because they've reduced what is a very wide road to a narrow lane because people have been parking where they're not supposed to. I even watched a police van, which I thought might do something about people parking on double yellows and those white lines where you're not supposed to park at all, but they just parked on the curb, so they're currently blocking somebody's drive because of their intelligence. And all because they're throwing this huge May Day thing. Now, great for people who want to get out and enjoy themselves. It's a fantastic way to spend your bank holiday if you've got the money and the wherewithal. I already know that I'm going to get irked because it'll mean loud music. You'll be able to hear them from my back garden. The bells in town at one of the churches haven't stopped ringing all day, so I don't know what's going on there. Either way, that's just today's Monday rant, because otherwise the walk, whilst full of people who aren't ordinarily walking down the towpath, it was nice. One boater got annoyed because somebody had closed the swing bridge, and I thought, well, the swing bridge has to be closed because somebody lives across there, so it's their only way to get onto the towpath to be able to get to civilization. But when I was walking back, they've left it open and clearly think that I'm on their side. I don't know how I know them, but I think it might just be from wandering down the towpath and conversing with them. But hey, these things occur. I have had some more inspiration while walking, so I am going to implement some of that in my writing over the next hour or so. I don't know what time my dad and my brother will be back, but I do know that my mother will be back earlier than usual today because she goes for an anticoagulant appointment, so she finishes earlier on a Monday. Still, that doesn't mean that I won't be able to write. I did wonder about getting some reading done of Streets of Laredo. I have done the great thing and read 2 pages so far, and I think that I really like the first line of this, which is, "Most train robbers ain't smart, which is a lucky thing for the railroads." I know that I'm going to enjoy this. I don't think I'll like it as much as Lonesome Dove. Lonesome Dove is a book that I have over time begun to consider my favourite book due to the nostalgia surrounding it, due to what I found upon reading it and the way that even now, which is 7 years since I read that book, the way that it lingers in my mind. So I'm looking forward to finally getting around to reading this, but I don't think it's going to be a patch on that one. But that's if I get to that one, because hopefully the inspiration is going to take over and I'm going to get a lot of good writing done over the next few hours. So the last hour has been a bit more difficult than I thought it would be. Perhaps it's because I'm writing directly onto my computer and I'm not writing in my notebook so I can see how much has been written on the screen, but it's felt like there's been the tiniest bit of a block, which is very upsetting because I wanted to get at least another 1,500 words written. Just had to move you there because the phone came springing out of the tripod. So admittedly, I did take some time where I wasn't writing to practice some more Italian and to speak to my mother because she rang me on her way home. Well, she rang me on her way to the shops from work. I practiced my Italian because I was hoping that in the 15 minutes away from the screen, that another break, another lull would be something that would help me figure out where next to go. I think I can see all the lines that it's got to go in my head, but I also worried that what I'd written had included so much information so fast that it was giving over too much to the reader. And I always go back to this thing that a author of a popular children's book series said about 20 years ago, when they said that they gave the plot of the entire book series away within the first chapter when they were first drafting it. And I was concerned that I was doing that here. So I asked Charlie of Charlie Brooke Reads whether she would mind just going over the first 1,000 words that I'd written. And she's got back in touch with me, said there's a paragraph that might not go over so well to children, but I can cope with one paragraph. It's tough for me because this idea just feels like it's constantly in my mind and it feels like it's rushing and there's this excitement there. And I don't want to lose that excitement in this worry that I'm trying for perfection immediately when I should just be trying to get the stuff down on the page, which is something that I regularly tell writers. And it's the advice that I give to people is that I think that that's what it is. It's sometimes I worry that my excitement means that I am cutting corners and I'm not giving information that is necessary for the telling of the story. So I'm almost rushing towards the next plot point without giving the story the time that it needs to bloom. But on that same note, there was information I thought necessary for the telling of this chapter to give an idea for the character's motives, for the reason that he might behave the way he does. There's a mention of older siblings, and I wanted to give the idea that this character feels like they're living in the shadow of their older siblings. before heading into what this book is actually going to be about. But it's tough. I think that that's the case with most things when it comes to writing, especially taking on another new project when I've got all these other things and not knowing whether this is going to be a project that I stick with. I will go and make another cup of tea because that's how I thrive when it comes to days of writing, just endless, copious amounts of tea. And maybe I'll give myself 5 minutes of reading to re-energise that part of me before my mum comes home, we make tea, and I can get knuckled down and writing properly. Either way, I do think there's going to be like a final part of this video tomorrow where I give an update as to everything that has happened. But for now, my plan is to try and clear my head because I've got myself really het up over the smallest things, which I knew was going to happen because we're crafting something that we don't understand ourselves yet. I didn't hit the 2,000 word mark like I'd wanted to do. I wrote 1,000 words, and I think that I am going to have to be happy with that. What I have to remember is that I am writing a story that's idea only presented itself to me last week, and although I have this want to rush through and get all of my thoughts down on paper, I need more of an idea of where the story is going at a certain point. Having sent what I'd written to Charlie really helped because she helped me get out of my own head, which can happen because rather than think about the fact that I'm writing a story and should be enjoying it for myself, as I was saying yesterday, I was going way too far ahead of myself and not just focusing on the now. I reached a point of finality in what I was writing and recognised that I didn't want to be writing the story on the computer anymore. I wanted to just get some stuff handwritten because I find that when I'm handwriting description, it comes a lot better than if I'm trying to write that directly onto the computer. I've said this before, I don't know what it is that's about writing by hand that I find more fluid and find that the thoughts flow a bit easier, but it's certainly still the case with this tale. And if I didn't wish to have something to present to the writers group on Thursday, I probably wouldn't have typed up what I'd been writing already. However, it did prove a good decision to make, simply so that I could see what it was looking like on the page and I could move the stuff around that I wanted to move around, because when I am writing, I can sometimes recognise that I want to add a bit more story in somewhere, and so I put an asterisk by it and then I go and write that. And there's a lot of going back and forth when reading my notebook to check, did I say this already? Where are we now? Where did we move to? So it was nice to have it all formulated as it would be and as I think it needs to be at the moment. I am very excited about the story, and I think that, how did Charlie put it yesterday? I can't say how Charlie put it yesterday because that would spoil what the book would be about, because I ended up telling her and seeing what she thought. And I didn't say what was happening in the entire story, but I found that when it comes to writing, sometimes I just need that person saying, just go with it. As I was talking about yesterday with friends in the past who I feel like I let down by not completing stories, sometimes I just need to get some of that excitement away from me, because I can be bursting to tell folk about it and then I'll tell them everything and then it doesn't get written. And it's this whole thing I heard about years ago where if you're talking about your writing, you're probably not writing. And either way, I did write 1,000 words extra than what I'd written in my notebook, and I spent more of the time researching, and so I've got some ideas as to where I want the story to go from the research I've done. There are certain things that still aren't named in the book that I would like to give more thought over how to name them, but otherwise I am content with what I did yesterday and the research that I put in, because I hate research. It's something that I've always talked about. It's something that I'll never do a huge session. I know there are writers out there who will do nothing but research for 6 months, then write the book, and it's full of everything they've done. I can't do that. I need to research as I go, because if I do it all beforehand, then the excitement wanes. It's what happened with a book that I was writing as a teenager, in which, well, it was at that time I was reading all the young adult fantasy, so I was writing a lot of young adult fantasy / paranormal romance, and so it was very stylistic of that. But I researched so much Celtic folklore and inserted it into the book. Well, I inserted it into my plans, that in the end I realised actually I'm just more interested in reading about the Celtic folklore than putting it into anything that I'm writing myself. But what I'm enjoying with the work that I did yesterday was just reading some of the folktales from the Peak District and seeing how maybe I could take folktales from other places and include them in my own tale that I was writing. But I'm glad that I did that, and I'm glad that I got the poems written for tomorrow night. So all in all, as a day of writing, I'm going to say that it was a success. Is it the most I've ever written in one day? No. But I'm the person who finished a 50,000 word novel in one day for National Novel Writing Month one year. And people have still said, how did you manage to do that? And as I have maintained ever since, I did not sleep, I did not use a single comma, and I regularly just wrote, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this person said this. And if it wasn't moving along fast enough, I would just introduce a werewolf, and we'd fight for a few pages, and then they'd go away, and then I don't remember much about that story other than there were half-demon people who were in some sort of Xavier-style institute from the X-Men, because I'd taken the story I'd really enjoyed and moved it to an institute because I was reading City of Bones. Lord, my goodness, I shock myself with my inability to be original sometimes. Anyway, that's me. That was my day of writing. If you're working on any writing projects, then please feel free to chat about them in the comments. Similarly, if you've got any questions, then feel free to ask those as well. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, because until next time, that is all.